The most dangerous transformation a man can undergo doesn't start with violence. It starts with patience. I was the kind of man who believed calm words were stronger than raised voices. I believed respect could solve what force never should. I believed that if you spoke clearly, honestly, and without anger, you would be heard. That belief didn't make me weak. It made me disciplined. It made me proud. And then slowly, it made me angry. Not because I wanted to be, not because I lacked control, but because I was taught quietly, repeatedly, that calm communication meant nothing, that patience carried no weight, that respect earned no response. This is not a story about bad men losing their temper. It's about how good men are trained to. Today I'm going to expose a psychological mechanism so subtle most people never see it happening until the damage is already done. A process that turns the most patient men into the very men they never wanted to become. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. And if you value clear thinking and honest reflection, consider subscribing. Every relationship looks personal from the inside. Emotions feel spontaneous. Conflicts feel accidental. Reactions feel justified. But beneath the surface, something far more mechanical is always taking place. Every relationship is a behavioral laboratory. I didn't see it that way at first. None of us do. We tell ourselves we're just two people figuring things out as we go. That love is organic. That communication is about intention. That if both people mean well, things will eventually align. That assumption is wrong. What actually happens inside a relationship is constant conditioning. Behaviors are reinforced or weakened based on what receives attention and what gets ignored. Responses shape future actions. Silence teaches lessons just as effectively as words. Over time, patterns harden, and those patterns decide what kind of people both partners become. In this laboratory, I was the test subject. Not because I was naive, not because I was weak, but because I was patient. I was raised with a clear framework for how men should handle conflict. Speak calmly, listen carefully, address issues early. Don't raise your voice. Don't intimidate. Don't dominate. Solve problems through clarity, not force. I carried those principles into my relationship without hesitation. They weren't strategies. They were values. At the beginning, nothing felt wrong. We'll call her Emily. She was intelligent, independent, and confident. I admired that. I respected her opinions. I gave her space. I assumed the mutual respect meant mutual responsiveness. Then small things started to surface. She was often late, not once or twice, but consistently. She made decisions that affected both of us without mentioning them beforehand. In group settings, she interrupted me or dismissed my perspective with a joke. None of these moments were dramatic. None of them were explosive, but they registered. So I did what I believed a healthy man should do. I brought it up calmly. I didn't accuse. I didn't demand. I didn't frame her as the problem. I spoke about how I felt. I explained why certain things mattered to me. I chose my words carefully. I waited for the right moment. I assumed goodwill. Her response wasn't hostile. It was worse. Nothing changed. Sometimes she brushed it off. Sometimes she minimized it. Sometimes she reframed it as my issue. You're reading too much into it. That's not what I meant. You're being sensitive. The tone wasn't aggressive. It was casual, almost bored. At first, I didn't see the danger. I told myself this was normal. People need time. Habits don't change overnight. Communication is a process. So I tried again. Different timing, same calm tone, same respect, same outcome. This is where most men misunderstand what's happening. They think the issue is miscommunication, that they need better words, better framing, better emotional intelligence. They believe the solution is refinement. But the problem isn't clarity. The problem is reinforcement. Without realizing it, Emily was teaching me something. Not through what she said, but through what she didn't respond to. She was teaching me that calm communication had no consequences, that respectful expression carried no urgency, that my preferred way of addressing problems could be safely ignored, and my brain was paying attention. Human behavior follows patterns whether we acknowledge them or not. When an action produces a result, the brain marks it as useful. When an action produces nothing, the brain quietly deprioritizes it. This isn't philosophy, it's conditioning. Each time I spoke calmly and nothing happened, a lesson was reinforced. This doesn't work. I didn't consciously think that. I felt it. I still believed in patience. I still believed in respectful dialogue. But now, there was friction between my values and my lived experience. I was doing everything right and getting nothing in return. No adjustment, no acknowledgement, no movement. That friction is where change begins. The relationship itself became the experiment. Emily didn't intend to run it. She wasn't malicious. She wasn't plotting to reshape my behavior. She was simply responding to what felt most pressing and ignoring what felt optional. And calm communication feels optional to people who aren't motivated to change. In her mind, there was no crisis, no immediate cost, no threat to stability. My tone signaled patience. My words suggested flexibility. My restraint communicated that the issue could wait, so it did. Meanwhile, inside me, something subtle was shifting. Not anger, not yet. Doubt. I started questioning whether my approach actually worked in the real world. I wondered if the principles I was raised with were idealistic, maybe outdated, maybe ineffective with certain personalities. That doubt matters. Because once a man doubts the effectiveness of his values, he becomes vulnerable to replacing them. I wasn't looking for dominance. I wasn't trying to control. I just wanted to be heard. And when you're consistently unheard, your mind begins searching for alternatives. Not consciously, automatically. The laboratory doesn't care about your intentions. It only measures outcomes. And the early data was clear. Calm words produced silence. Respect produced dismissal. Patience produced nothing. At this stage, many men still believe they're in control of who they're becoming. They think character is static, that as long as they don't choose to change, they won't. But character isn't formed by declarations. It's shaped by repetition. Every ignored concern was a repetition. Every dismissed feeling was a data point. Every calm conversation that went nowhere quietly taught me what kind of man this relationship rewarded. And it wasn't the man I thought I was. I didn't know it yet. But the conditioning had already begun. Once a pattern begins, it doesn't announce itself. It repeats quietly, waiting to be noticed. Most people never notice. They just feel the consequences later and call it change or growing apart. After the first few failed conversations, I didn't feel angry. I felt responsible. That's the default position of a patient man. When something doesn't work, he assumes he needs to adjust. So I adjusted. I waited for better moments. Not after a long day, not in public, not when emotions were high. I chose calm evenings, neutral settings, times when there was no obvious distraction. I told myself that timing mattered, and if I respected the process, the outcome would eventually follow. I changed my language. I removed anything that could sound like blame. I focused only on my internal experience. I used I statements. I emphasized understanding. I reassured her that I wasn't attacking her character. I wasn't trying to control her behavior. I just wanted alignment. I feel dismissed when decisions are made without including me. I feel disconnected when I'm interrupted in front of other people. I don't need perfection. I just need consideration. Each sentence was measured. Each conversation was intentional. Each result was the same. Nothing shifted. Sometimes she nodded. Sometimes she said she understood. Sometimes she said she'd try. But nothing in her behavior actually changed. The lateness continued. The dismissals repeated. The boundaries remained theoretical. This is the stage where most men make a critical mistake in their interpretation. They think the woman disagrees, but disagreement still engages the issue. What I was facing wasn't disagreement, it was non-response. And non-response is the most powerful form of conditioning there is. When you disagree with someone, you still acknowledge their relevance. When you ignore someone, you teach them that their input doesn't matter. That's not a message delivered through words. It's delivered through patterns. At this point, my mind began running a quiet internal dialogue. Maybe I'm not being clear enough. Maybe I need to explain it differently. Maybe I'm not expressing how important this really is. This is how the escalation begins, not with shouting, with precision. I became more detailed. I gave examples. I connected patterns. I explained impact. I laid out cause and effect. I thought, if I could just make the logic undeniable, she would have to respond. She didn't. And here's the psychological trap. Every time a patient man's respectful communication fails, he doesn't abandon respect. He doubles down on effort. He invests more energy. He refines his approach. He gives the benefit of the doubt longer than he should. That generosity becomes the mechanism of his own conditioning. Because while he's experimenting with better communication, the system is experimenting on him. Emily wasn't evaluating my arguments. She was responding to intensity. Or more accurately, she wasn't responding to the lack of it. Calm communication blends into the background when someone doesn't feel immediate pressure to act. It signals safety. It signals flexibility. It signals that consequences are distant if they exist at all. So she postponed. She deprioritized. She forgot. From her perspective, nothing was wrong enough to demand action. From mine, something was deeply wrong. I started to notice a strange internal tension building. I wasn't angry at her. I was frustrated with reality, with the apparent disconnect between how I believed communication should work and how it actually worked in this relationship. That frustration didn't explode, it accumulated. Each ignored conversation stacked on the last one. Each unacknowledged concern added weight. And because I refused to express anger, that weight had nowhere to go. It turned inward. I questioned my competence, my emotional intelligence, my masculinity. Not in dramatic ways, in quiet ones. Maybe I'm too passive. Maybe this is what women mean when they say men don't lead. Maybe calm communication only works in theory. These thoughts didn't make me aggressive. They made me uncertain. And uncertainty is dangerous because it destabilizes identity. A man who knows who he is can tolerate resistance. A man who starts doubting himself begins searching for proof. I wasn't trying to change Emily. I was trying to confirm that my way of being in the world still worked, that my values weren't naive, that respect wasn't obsolete. But the relationship kept delivering the same feedback. Silence, dismissal, deflection. Over time, something subtle happened. I began feeling a spike of tension before bringing things up. Not fear, anticipation. My body already knew the outcome. My mind still hoped for a different one. That mismatch matters. When your expectations repeatedly collide with reality, your nervous system adapts before your beliefs do. It prepares for escalation even if you haven't chosen it yet. I started feeling irritation sooner. Not because the issues were bigger, but because the tolerance threshold was shrinking. My patience wasn't infinite. It was being consumed by repetition. Still, I resisted. I told myself I wouldn't become that guy. I had judged men who raised their voices. I had seen how quickly anger turned into justification. I didn't want power through volume. I wanted mutual understanding. So I held the line. And in doing so, I unknowingly taught the relationship something important. I taught it that I would tolerate being ignored. That lesson didn't make Emily a villain. It made her comfortable. Comfortable enough to continue as she was. Comfortable enough to let my calm requests dissolve into background noise. Comfortable enough to believe that if something really mattered, I would express it differently. That belief set the stage for what came next. Because when calm communication is consistently ignored, the mind doesn't ask whether escalation is ethical. It asks whether escalation works. And soon, I was going to find out. At some point, patience stops feeling like a virtue and starts feeling like a liability. Not because the man has changed, but because the environment has taught him that restraint has no value. That shift didn't happen overnight. It happened quietly in the space between conversations that went nowhere. By the time I reached this stage, I wasn't confused anymore. I was tired. I had exhausted every version of calm communication I knew how to use. I had adjusted timing, language, tone, framing, and context. I had done the work people always recommend. Listen more, speak softer, be understanding, stay regulated, and nothing had changed. This is where the conditioning becomes unmistakable. When an organism repeatedly performs a behavior that produces no outcome, the behavior weakens, not morally, neurologically. The brain stops investing energy in actions that don't alter the environment. It doesn't care how noble those actions are. My brain was learning a brutal lesson. Respectful communication was ineffective here. I didn't consciously abandon it. I simply felt less motivated to use it. The internal resistance grew. Each time I considered bringing something up calmly, a quiet voice asked, "What's the point?" That question is the hinge. Once it appears, escalation is no longer about losing control. It's about efficiency. I began to notice something uncomfortable. When I spoke with slightly more firmness, still controlled but sharper, she paid more attention. Not consistently, not reliably, but enough for my brain to register the difference. This is how the escalation algorithm begins. The mind tests intensity the same way it tests solutions, incrementally. First, a more serious tone, then a longer conversation, then repeating the same concern with more insistence. Each increase was small, almost unnoticeable. I still wasn't angry, but I was no longer fully calm, and the feedback changed. She listened longer. She responded more quickly. She didn't dismiss it as easily. That was the first data point. The problem wasn't that I wanted to raise my voice. The problem was that my nervous system was tracking results, and results were now correlated with pressure. This is the part that destroys men's self-concept. We like to believe anger is a choice, that losing patience is a moral failure, that if a man becomes louder or harsher, it's because he lacks discipline. That belief collapses when anger becomes the only thing that produces movement. I still resisted it. I I still pulled back. I told myself I was imagining the difference, that it wasn't real, that I shouldn't rely on intensity. So I tried alternatives. I tried humor, lightness, making things playful. I thought maybe tension was the problem. Maybe if I reduced seriousness, she'd be more receptive. She wasn't. I tried affection, more closeness, more warmth. I thought emotional safety might open the door to responsiveness. It didn't. I tried patience at a higher level, letting things go, telling myself some issues weren't worth addressing. That compromise meant acceptance. That worked only in one sense. It reduced conflict. It also erased me. Each alternative that failed pushed my mind toward the same conclusion. Nothing works except escalation. I didn't want that to be true. I fought it, I delayed it, I avoided it. But the relationship had already built a system where calm communication was filtered out and emotional intensity cut through. And systems don't respond to ideals. They respond to pressure. The moment came unexpectedly. It always does. It wasn't during a major argument. It was over something small, something that had been ignored too many times, something that had accumulated weight simply through repetition. I raised my voice, not in rage, not in cruelty, in exhaustion, and something changed instantly. She stopped. She looked at me. She listened. There was no confusion, no deflection, no dismissal. The issue was suddenly acknowledged as real, important, worth addressing now. She apologized. She explained. She promised adjustment. In that moment, the conditioning completed itself. My brain recorded the outcome. Anger worked, not because it was loud, but because it created urgency, because it disrupted her comfort, because it triggered a response she could no longer postpone. The tragedy is that from the outside, this looks like a man finally losing his temper, like a failure of self-control, like proof that he was always angry underneath. From the inside, it feels like betrayal. Betrayal of self. I didn't feel powerful. I felt sick. I had become effective by becoming someone I didn't respect. And the worst part was knowing that the system rewarded it. That reward is what changes a man. Once you've learned that anger gets results, your nervous system doesn't forget. It doesn't care that you dislike the method. It cares that the method works. This creates an internal fracture. Part of you wants to return to calm communication. Another part knows it's useless. Part of you values respect. Another part values being heard. And in a system that forces you to choose, something has to give. This is why patient men don't suddenly become angry men. They become divided men first. They start scanning for the minimum intensity required to be taken seriously. They ration calmness. They save patience for situations where it might still function. Over time, the baseline shifts. What was once a last resort becomes a tool. What was once a tool becomes a habit. What was once a habit becomes an identity. And the man looks at himself one day and doesn't recognize who he's become. Not because he chose anger, but because anger was chosen for him. Once anger proves effective, the relationship changes its rules. Not officially, not openly, but functionally. What had been a last resort became a reference point. My nervous system now knew the threshold required to produce a response. And knowing that threshold made everything below it feel pointless. This is where escalation stops being accidental and starts becoming strategic. I didn't wake up deciding to be more aggressive. I woke up aware that calm requests disappeared into silence, aware that measured conversations were treated as optional, aware that only disruption created movement. So my brain adjusted. I began unconsciously calculating tone before speaking, not words. Tone. I felt out how firm I needed to be, how serious, how much pressure was required to cross the line between being ignored and being addressed. This wasn't anger yet. It was controlled intensity, and it worked more often than anything else I'd tried. That's how the escalation algorithm tightens its grip. It doesn't jump from patience to rage. It moves step by step, teaching the man that each additional degree of intensity increases effectiveness. Directness replaced gentleness. Firmness replaced flexibility. Persistence replaced trust. Each shift felt justified, logical, necessary. From the outside, it might have looked like confidence, like leadership, like a man finally standing up for himself. Some people even encourage this transition. They mistake escalation for growth. But inside, I felt something corroding, because I wasn't standing up for myself. I was adapting to a broken system. The more I relied on pressure, the less I trusted respect. The more intensity I used, the less faith I had in mutual understanding. And that erosion didn't stay contained within communication. It began infecting how I saw the relationship itself. I started anticipating resistance before it appeared. I assumed dismissal before it happened. I spoke with edge not because I was angry, but because I expected indifference. Expectation shapes behavior. When you expect not to be heard, you speak as if you won't be. Your tone hardens. Your patience shortens. Your tolerance thins. And when the other person reacts defensively to that tone, it confirms your expectation. The loop tightens. Emily began responding to me differently as well. Not with more respect, but with more caution. She paid attention when my voice carried weight. She disengaged when it didn't. This is the moment many people misunderstand. They think the woman starts respecting the man because he's more assertive. That's not what's happening. She's responding to discomfort. Intensity signals conflict. Conflict threatens stability. Stability matters to her. So she responds to remove the threat, not to address the underlying issue, but to neutralize the emotional disturbance. That distinction matters, because it means the man isn't being heard, he's being managed. And once a man realizes that, consciously or not, his relationship to anger shifts again. Anger stops feeling shameful. It starts feeling necessary, not enjoyable. Necessary. This is how dependency forms. I didn't enjoy raising my voice. I dreaded it. But I also dreaded being invisible. And between those two, my nervous system chose visibility. Over time, something subtle but dangerous occurred. My emotional baseline rose. I became irritated faster, not explosively, predictably. My body was preparing for escalation before it was required, because past experience told it that escalation was inevitable. This is what people miss when they judge angry men. They assume anger is spontaneous. It isn't. It's rehearsed by repetition. Each time intensity works, the threshold for using it drops. Each time patience fails, the cost of restraint rises. Eventually, calm communication doesn't just feel ineffective. It feels dishonest, like pretending something works when you know it doesn't. That internal conflict drains a man. I felt myself becoming sharper in other areas of life, more reactive, less tolerant of inefficiency, less forgiving of delays. The relationship had trained my nervous system to associate friction with results. That training doesn't stay compartmentalized. I began questioning myself again, but differently this time. Why am I like this now? Why do I feel on edge so often? Why do I sound like someone I used to judge? The answers weren't comforting. I hadn't changed because I wanted to. I had changed because the environment demanded it. And environments that demand your deterioration don't announce themselves as toxic. They present themselves as challenging. This is where many patient men lose years of their lives. They mistake adaptation for maturity. They believe becoming harder is becoming stronger. They convince themselves this is just what relationships require. But strength that requires self-betrayal isn't strength. It's erosion with a justification. As the pattern solidified, Emily's perception of me shifted too. She started seeing me as the aggressive one, the difficult one, the man who made everything tense. From her perspective, that was true. She didn't see the months of calm conversations that went nowhere. She didn't feel the internal resistance I overcame each time I escalated. She only experienced the pressure, and pressure breeds resentment. She began bracing for conflict before it happened. I began bracing for dismissal before I spoke. We were both preparing for the worst version of each other. That's how the dynamic becomes self-reinforcing. She responded only when I escalated. I escalated because she only responded then. Neither of us felt understood. Both of us felt justified. And both of us were trapped in a system neither of us had consciously designed. At this stage, the man faces a dangerous illusion. He believes anger is his choice now. It isn't. It's his conditioning. And conditioning doesn't disappear because you recognize it. It disappears only when the system that reinforces it changes. But most men don't change the system. They adapt to it. And adaptation has a cost. By this point, I wasn't just angry sometimes. I was someone who expected to need anger, someone who had learned that respect without force was decoration. That realization is devastating to a man who values character. Because now the question isn't how to communicate better. It's who you're becoming in order to be heard. And once that question appears, the relationship is already standing on a fault line. There is a moment when a man realizes he has crossed a line he promised himself he never would. Not in a dramatic explosion, not in a loss of control, but in a quiet recognition that something inside him has shifted permanently. For me, that moment came after anger stopped surprising me. At first, every escalation carried guilt. I replayed conversations afterward, critiquing my tone, wishing I'd stayed calmer. I told myself it was temporary, a reaction to unusual circumstances, something I would correct once things stabilized. But things didn't stabilize. They normalized. Anger stopped being an exception and became a tool. Not frequent at first, just available. Something my nervous system kept within reach, like a key that fit a lock I never wanted to open, but knew worked. This is where the conditioning becomes truly insidious. Once a pattern proves effective, it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like the only realistic option. And when anger becomes the only option that produces change, resisting it starts to feel irresponsible rather than virtuous. I found myself thinking, why should I speak calmly when I know it will be ignored? Why should I pretend patience works when it doesn't? Those thoughts don't come from cruelty. They come from exhaustion. The real cost wasn't what Emily thought of me. It was what I thought of myself. I had built my identity around restraint, around being the man who could handle conflict without raising his voice, around being emotionally steady. Becoming someone who relied on intensity felt like self-betrayal. And yet, the relationship rewarded it. Each time I escalated, she engaged. Each time I didn't, she disengaged. The lesson was reinforced again and again until my nervous system stopped questioning it. This creates a psychological fracture. Logical. On one side is the man you believe you are. On the other is the man your environment requires you to be. Living between those two erodes self-respect faster than almost anything else. I started questioning my past. Was I ever really patient, or was I just suppressing anger? Was my identity built on avoidance rather than strength? These questions are dangerous because they rewrite your self-narrative. They make you doubt the very traits that once anchored you. Meanwhile, Emily's experience was entirely different. From her perspective, I had changed. I had become more volatile, more intense, less pleasant. She didn't experience the conditioning process. She experienced the output. And she didn't connect her earlier indifference with my later escalation. That disconnect is what traps both people. She began responding to my anger with compliance, not understanding. Her goal wasn't resolution. It was restoration of peace. She wanted the tension gone. She wanted the volume lowered. She wanted equilibrium back. So she did what worked. She listened. She apologized. She promised to adjust. But those promises were rarely rooted in respect for my calm voice. They were reactions to disruption. That matters because it means the system never reset. It only paused. After each conflict, there was a brief calm, a sense of relief. Then slowly, the old patterns returned. The lateness, the dismissals, the casual disregard, and with them the need to escalate again. This is how anger becomes habitual, not because the man enjoys it, but because the relationship demands it repeatedly. Over time, I noticed something unsettling. I was faster to irritation even when the issue was minor. My tolerance was gone, not because I was angrier by nature, but because my nervous system had learned to anticipate resistance. Anticipation creates readiness. Readiness lowers thresholds. I wasn't waiting to see if calm communication would work. I already knew it wouldn't. So I skipped steps. That's when I realized something important. I wasn't choosing anger. I was being trained into it. Training doesn't ask permission. It happens through exposure, through repetition, through reinforcement. This is why telling men to just communicate better misses the point. Communication style doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's shaped by the responses it receives. You can only knock on a door politely so many times before you start pounding. The tragedy is that once this stage is reached, both people begin hating the dynamic, but neither understands how to escape it. Emily saw me as an angry man who overreacted. I saw her as someone who forced escalation by ignoring anything else. Both interpretations contained truth. Neither explained the full system. And systems don't break because you blame the other person. They break when you stop participating. But stopping isn't simple when your character has already been reshaped. I began to feel a growing sense of alienation from myself. I didn't like how I spoke. I didn't like how tense I felt. I didn't like how quickly I moved from calm to irritation. This wasn't who I wanted to be, but it was who the relationship rewarded. That realization leads to a crossroads. Not immediately, not dramatically, quietly. A man begins to ask himself whether maintaining the relationship is worth continuing to become someone he doesn't respect. That question doesn't come from anger. It comes from grief. Grief for the version of himself that once believed patience was enough. Grief for the man who thought respect was currency. Grief for the self that existed before the conditioning took hold. And once that grief is acknowledged, the relationship can no longer continue unchanged, because the man now understands the cost. And he must decide how much more he's willing to pay. When a patient man finally understands what has happened to him, he stands at a psychological crossroads. Not a dramatic one, Not a single moment of clarity, but a slow, unavoidable recognition that continuing as he is will shape who he becomes. At that point, there are only three paths forward. Most men don't consciously choose. They drift. They slide into the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance is usually the one already reinforced. The first path is escalation. This is where anger stops feeling like a compromise and starts feeling like a requirement. The man accepts intensity as his primary tool. He no longer waits to see if calm communication will work. He assumes it won't. He speaks with edge from the beginning. Over time, this creates what looks like an angry man. But the truth is more specific. It creates a man who is dependent on anger to be heard. This isn't addiction in the sense of pleasure. There's no satisfaction in it. There's dependency. The man doesn't enjoy being angry. He relies on it. It's the only lever that moves the environment. That reliance reshapes his identity. He stops seeing himself as patient. He starts seeing patience as weakness. He reinterprets his past restraint as naivete. He adopts a harder shell not because it feels right, but because it feels effective. The psychological cost is enormous. He loses respect for himself as he watches himself become someone he used to criticize. He feels shame after conflicts, then justifies that shame by pointing to results. I don't like how I act, but at least things get done. That internal bargain corrodes character. The second path is internal collapse. Some men cannot tolerate becoming someone they despise. The idea of relying on anger feels worse than being ignored. So they choose silence. They stop bringing things up. They stop expressing needs. They stop setting boundaries. They tell themselves it's not worth the conflict, that peace matters more than being heard. From the outside, this looks like maturity, like acceptance, like emotional control. From the inside, it feels like disappearance. These men become emotionally absent while remaining physically present. They withdraw not out of indifference, but out of self-protection. Each unexpressed concern is a concession. Each swallowed frustration is a retreat. Psychologically, this creates learned helplessness. The man teaches himself that his voice doesn't matter, that nothing he says will change the environment, that the safest option is to adapt internally rather than push externally. But suppressed needs don't vanish. They ferment. Resentment accumulates quietly. It leaks out sideways. Passive aggression, sarcasm, emotional distance, disengagement. The man is no longer angry. He's hollow. And hollow men don't build strong relationships. They endure them. The third path is strategic exit. This is the path chosen by men who recognize the conditioning process and refuse to let it continue. They understand that staying in a system that rewards their worst self will eventually make that self permanent. These men don't leave in anger. They leave in clarity. They see that compatibility isn't just about attraction or shared values. It's about responsiveness, about whether calm communication is respected or ignored, about whether the relationship requires them to abandon who they are. This path requires the most self-awareness and the highest tolerance for loss. Walking away means accepting that love is not enough to justify self-erosion. It means prioritizing long-term character over short-term connection. It means choosing to remain someone you respect, even if it costs you someone you care about. Most men avoid this path because it feels like failure, because it requires admitting that patience didn't fix things, because it means grieving not just the relationship, but the version of the future you imagined. But it's the only path that preserves identity. Each of these paths leads to a different man. The escalator becomes louder, harsher, and more reactive over time. The collapsed man becomes quieter, colder, and increasingly detached. The exiting man becomes more selective, more grounded, and more aware of his boundaries. None of these paths are morally superior. They're responses to the same conditioning. What matters is that the conditioning was real. This wasn't about temperament. It wasn't about anger management. It wasn't about emotional maturity. It was about reinforcement. The environment taught the man what worked and punished what didn't. The man adapted accordingly. This is why blaming men for becoming angry misses the root of the issue, and why blaming women for men's anger also misses the point. The system itself is the problem. Once I saw these paths clearly, I understood something that changed how I viewed the relationship. Continuing without choosing was still choosing. Staying while escalating meant I was choosing to become harder. Staying while collapsing meant I was choosing to disappear. Leaving meant I was choosing to preserve my values. Avoiding the decision was no longer an option. That realization stripped the situation of its emotional fog. It reframed the conflict from, how do we fix this, to who am I becoming if I don't leave? That question cuts deeper than any argument. Because relationships don't just determine how you feel, they determine who you become. And once a man sees that clearly, he can no longer pretend, that endurance is the same as strength. The crossroads isn't about love. It's about identity. And identity, once compromised, repeatedly doesn't recover by accident. To understand how patient men are transformed, you have to stop thinking in terms of intentions and start thinking in terms of mechanisms. Most damage in relationships isn't caused by malice. It's caused by unconscious reinforcement patterns that operate regardless of what either person believes about themselves. The first mechanism is selective response. Emily never decided to ignore calm communication and reward angry communication. She simply responded to what felt urgent and postponed what felt optional. That distinction is subtle, but it's everything. When I spoke calmly, my tone signaled stability. Stability doesn't demand immediate action. It suggests flexibility. It implies that the issue can wait. Her mind categorized my concerns as non-critical input, something to be addressed later or forgotten entirely. When I escalated, the signal changed. Intensity cut through the noise. It triggered attention not because of respect, but because of disruption. Emotional pressure forces prioritization. Her nervous system reacted before her reasoning did. That difference created a powerful reinforcement schedule. Psychologists know that intermittent reinforcement is the most effective way to shape behavior. When a behavior sometimes produces results and sometimes doesn't, the brain works harder to refine it. But what was happening here was even more precise. It was differential reinforcement based on emotional intensity. Calm communication had a near zero success rate. Escalated communication had a high success rate. My brain didn't need a spreadsheet to see the pattern. It adapted automatically. The second mechanism is the urgency illusion. When I finally raised my voice and she responded, both of us misinterpreted what had happened. We believed the issue had finally reached a level of seriousness that justified action. That wasn't true. The issue had been serious the entire time. What changed wasn't its importance. It was its presentation. Volume replaced content. Intensity replaced clarity. But the brain doesn't analyze that distinction in the moment. It simply associates urgency with escalation. This illusion reinforces the idea that anger is necessary to communicate importance. That calm expression equals low priority. Over time, that belief becomes embedded. The third mechanism is respect erosion. When a woman consistently ignores a man's calm communication, she unintentionally communicates that his respectful expression is not worthy of attention. This isn't a verbal message. It's a behavioral one. Respect isn't declared. It's demonstrated through responsiveness. Each ignored concern tells the man that his preferred way of engaging with the world carries no weight, that his values aren't currency in this relationship, that his best self is ineffective here. That creates what I think of as a respect recession. His calm voice depreciates. His intensity appreciates. The relationship economy shifts accordingly. At the same time, the woman's perception shifts in the opposite direction. She begins to associate the man with tension rather than thoughtfulness, with conflict rather than clarity. She doesn't see the conditioning. She sees the outcome. This creates a feedback loop of mutual misunderstanding. He feels disrespected because he must escalate to be heard. She feels threatened because he escalates to be heard. Both reactions make sense. Neither resolves the system. The fourth mechanism is cognitive dissonance. Patient men are taught that anger is unacceptable, that raising your voice is abusive, that any form of aggression is toxic masculinity. These messages are deeply ingrained. At the same time, the relationship teaches him that anger is the only effective communication tool available. This creates an impossible double bind. If he stays calm, his needs are ignored. If he escalates, he violates his values and risks social condemnation. Either way, he loses. Double binds don't create healthy adaptation. They create psychological strain. The man begins questioning himself rather than the system. He wonders if he's secretly aggressive, if his restraint was a facade, if he deserves the discomfort he feels. That self-doubt accelerates erosion. The fifth mechanism is attention economics. Modern life is saturated with input. Requests, messages, responsibilities, and stimuli compete constantly for attention. In this environment, emotional intensity becomes a filter. Calm communication blends in. Intense communication stands out. This isn't a moral failing. It's a cognitive reality. Human brains evolved to prioritize emotional signals because they historically indicated danger or opportunity. In a relationship context, this ancient wiring misfires. A patient man's calm request enters the same queue as dozens of other low-intensity inputs. It's processed slowly or deferred indefinitely. An angry outburst bypasses the queue entirely. The man learns that intensity is the shortcut. The sixth mechanism is patience paradox. Patient men give the system time to train them. They don't escalate quickly. They try repeatedly. They assume good intent. They tolerate non-response longer than they should. That tolerance allows the conditioning process to run to completion. An impatient man escalates early. He establishes that he expects responsiveness. The pattern is set before disrespect can become normalized. The patient man does the opposite. He gives the relationship months or years of data, showing that calm communication can be ignored without consequence. By the time he escalates, the pattern is deeply ingrained. This is why the men most committed to healthy communication are often the ones who lose it. Their virtue becomes their vulnerability. The final mechanism is misattribution. When escalation finally produces results, the man believes he has made his partner understand. The woman believes the man overreacted. Both are wrong. She didn't understand more. She reacted faster. He didn't communicate better. He communicated louder. Because neither sees the system, both blame each other. And as long as blame replaces understanding, the pattern continues. This is how good intentions produce bad outcomes. Not through cruelty, through reinforcement. There is a particular cruelty in how this dynamic collides with modern cultural expectations. Patient men don't just struggle inside their relationships. They struggle inside a moral framework that condemns the very behavior they're being trained to adopt. From the time their young men are told that anger is dangerous, that raised voices are abuse, that intensity is evidence of emotional immaturity, they're taught that the highest form of masculinity is calm, regulated, respectful communication. Then they enter relationships where calm communication is systematically ignored. This contradiction creates a psychological trap that has no clean exit. If the man stays calm, he's invisible. If he escalates, he's toxic. There is no path that preserves both his needs and his moral standing. That tension eats at him. He begins to feel defective, not situationally, but fundamentally, as if there is something wrong with his temperament, something outdated about his values, something naive about his expectations. And because society is quick to diagnose male anger and slow to examine relational conditioning, the blame lands where it's easiest, on him, told to regulate better, to communicate more clearly, to seek therapy, to examine his triggers. Rarely does anyone ask what kind of environment he's been adapting to. This cultural blind spot accelerates character erosion. A man who might have recognized the system and exited earlier now doubts himself instead. He stays longer. He escalates more. He internalizes shame. And shame doesn't make men softer. It makes them brittle. Over time, the erosion spreads beyond the relationship. The man who learned that intensity works begins using it elsewhere. At work, with family, in social settings. Not because he wants to dominate, but because his nervous system has been trained to associate pressure with effectiveness. This is how one relationship can reshape an entire personality. It doesn't require trauma. It doesn't require abuse. It only requires consistent reinforcement. The most tragic part is how invisible the process is to both sides. The woman often considers herself an advocate for healthy masculinity. She genuinely believes she wants a man who communicates calmly and respectfully. She just doesn't realize she's built a relational environment where those traits are punished with indifference. From her perspective, she's dealing with a man who became increasingly angry over time. She doesn't remember the calm requests, or she remembers them as minor, unimportant, not worth immediate action. Memory is shaped by emotional intensity. She recalls the loud moments. She forgets the quiet ones. This selective memory reinforces her belief that the man has an anger problem. Meanwhile, the man remembers every ignored conversation, every dismissed concern, every attempt to do things the right way. He doesn't forget them because they cost him something. Both narratives feel true. Neither captures the system. This disconnect creates a feedback loop of resentment. He resents her for forcing escalation. She resents him for escalating. Respect decays from both sides. Once respect is gone, interpretation turns hostile. Neutral actions are seen as threats. Small issues become symbolic. Every conflict feels like evidence rather than an isolated event. At this stage, even if both people want to fix things, they're operating from damaged ground. The man no longer trusts calm communication. The woman no longer trusts his emotional stability. Every interaction is filtered through suspicion. This is where many relationships die slowly. Not through a final argument, but through a gradual loss of goodwill. The man stops believing he can be himself. and be respected. The woman stops believing she can feel safe without control. Both are wrong, but the system has already trained them to think this way. The most painful realization for the patient man is recognizing how much of himself he's already lost. He looks back and sees a timeline of small concessions. Each one seemed reasonable. Each one seemed temporary. Together, they reshaped him. He wonders how many years it will take to unlearn what this relationship taught him. Because conditioning doesn't disappear when the relationship ends. It lingers. Men who leave these dynamics often find themselves quicker to anger in future relationships, not because the new partner deserves it, but because the nervous system is still calibrated to expect resistance. That's the hidden cost. This isn't just about one relationship failing. It's about the downstream effects on future connections, on children who witness tension, on workplaces shaped by reactive leadership, on communities where patience has been replaced by pressure. When we train patient men to become angry men, we don't just damage relationships. We damage the social fabric. And yet, this pattern continues because it's rarely named. We talk about anger management without talking about conditioning. We talk about communication skills without talking about responsiveness. We talk about respect without measuring behavior. As long as we frame the problem as individual pathology rather than systemic reinforcement, we'll keep producing the same outcomes. Good men who don't recognize what's happening to them. Good women who don't realize what they're teaching. Relationships that slowly convert virtue into liability. By the time the damage is obvious, it's usually too late. The man is no longer patient. The woman is no longer receptive. And the system that created both is invisible to them. That's the cruel irony. The very men society claims to want are systematically trained out of existence. The most important lesson in all of this is not about anger or gender or even relationships. It's about what you allow to shape your character over time. Every environment you stay in is teaching you something, not through words, but through consequences. It teaches you what parts of yourself are rewarded and which parts are ignored. And slowly, quietly, you become what works in that environment. That's why patience can disappear without you ever choosing to abandon it. That's why good intentions don't protect good character. And that's why love on its own is never enough to justify staying where your best self is slowly trained out of you. Healthy relationships don't require you to become louder, harder, or less humane just to be taken seriously. They don't punish calm communication with silence. They don't force you to choose between being heard and being someone you respect. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: pay attention to who you are becoming, not just how you feel. Feelings fluctuate. Identity compounds. If a relationship consistently rewards your worst instincts and ignores your best ones, the cost won't show up immediately. It will show up years later when you realize you no longer recognize your own voice. I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever felt yourself changing in a relationship, becoming sharper, quieter, or more distant just to survive it? Share your experience in the comments. Someone else reading may need to know they're not alone. And if this kind of honest, grounded reflection matters to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Not for noise, for clarity.